Kim. How you doing?
Morning, council member.
Mr. Kim, tell me what the relevance is of the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners.
I was hoping you'd tell me that, actually. No. From my understanding, there needs to be some way.
I'm still trying to be convinced.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Ooh, I don't know if I should be the person to convince you about this. Well, from my understanding, and being new, and I still really do need to get a better sense from actually participating on the bunk and meeting more with council members and with neighborhood council members. But my understanding is that it is a single body that is going to help set policy and help look at capacity building and training issues for the entire neighborhood council system. I come to this with a particular sort of perspective where having done a lot of community organizing and work around getting the community's voices codified and heard is going to be an interesting sort of experience for me.
Something about the bond committee that it's set apart from the neighborhood council system,
right.
And the culture is very different. It's almost like you move on to sort of a higher level body, and you become higher level thinking. Right. And it doesn't, in my mind, the actions and recommendations don't necessarily support the neighborhood councils individually or collectively. So
right.
That's why I say I'm not sure that that the intended purpose is there. I was under the impression that Bonk was going to reflect the neighborhood council systems and represent it and make decisions to enhance the neighborhood council system.
Right.
And sometimes they seem to be working at cross purposes. Also, we've had a problem with quorums. I think that's been largely resolved, but there was a time when there was a problem with quorums. Is that a problem with you?
It shouldn't be. I've spoken over, talked this over with my family.
What is your schedule?
I pretty much just hang out most of the time.
I hope not at City Hall. We have enough of those.
Right. No, I am the co-director of the Advancement Project, so that keeps me fairly busy.
Yeah, tell me about the Advancement Project.
Sure. So the Advancement Project is a public policy organization here it's a national public policy organization. We have offices here in Los Angeles, D.C., and Sacramento. The work that I do there, I run the Healthy City Project, which is really sort of Google for the public sector. And the idea is to get good data and good analysis in the hands of the community and decision makers so we could do more data-driven planning and collective planning.
Is it sort of a think tank?
We like to call ourselves an action tank, actually, because we don't want to just sit around and think about the issues, but actually help move and make progress on those issues. So you may know some of the other co-directors a little bit more than me. So Connie Rice is another co-director, Molly Munger, and then myself, and Steve English. I do, Councilmember, want to just note back to the previous comment about the culture. My understanding is that the body is not that big of a body. I'll be joining, I think, maybe 4 or 5 other BONC members. So I do believe that there's an opportunity to sort of adjust and make malleable this culture to be more reflective of what you think and all of us think should its role properly be.
Yeah, I think that would be all of our goals. We have one card on your appointment.
Okay.
Jim McQuiston?
Jim McQuiston. I welcome any new member to the BONC, but I am kind of distressed at the lack of knowledge of the commission that the speaker has just indicated. I did want to point out to him that right now I just made a survey of the Tuesday and Wednesday agendas for the City Council, Transportation Committee, Plum Committee, the City Council itself. We come up with 96 items on the agenda. And you know that the neighborhood councils fought like mad to get a position on the agendas so they can put on their statements. There were none submitted on any of the 96 on these agendas. So I am concerned about that, and I hope that the bank will take notice of this and do something about it, because we have to have more NC participation. Otherwise, what good are the NCs?
Should I respond to that?
You don't have to, but
Right. Well, I do think the vast majority of that may not have been pointed directly towards me, but for the opening statement there, I mean, with all due respect, my statements here really, I hope, reflect an openness to learn as I move in, as opposed to coming in with a sort of preset judged set of agendas as we walk in. So I doubt
actually,
it.
I was hoping you'd respond to the other part of this.
You want me to work that one out for you too?
No, the part about getting neighborhood councils more engaged in commenting on items before the council.
Right.
What he was referring to was actions we took to sort of enable the neighborhood council system to weigh in on agenda items in committees.
Right.
And Mr. McChristen was saying he checked on some 90-some items, and not one neighborhood council checked in. So he was, I think, asking you to see what you could do about getting neighborhood councils to weigh in more often on committee items. Sure.
Well, coming to the bank, I would probably want to carry one principle that I've carried throughout my career, which is it's rarely, if there's a dysfunction that you see in a system, you should first blame the system rather than the people. And so what I would want to look at is how can we build the capacity and provide trainings and provide the right kinds of institutional doorways and bridges so that these council members, these neighborhood council members, could actually better participate. Too often we would just then, if something like this would happen, we'd actually blame the actual council members themselves, but I just think we need to focus much more on the system as opposed to the people.
Okay, I have no problem with this appointment. No problem. I have no problem with this appointment. And don't, I hope you don't misunderstand my comments. The members I found to be very qualified, very generally responsible people, except for that problem we had with establishing a quorum. But they're good people, well-intentioned, involved in the community, exactly the type of people you would want to see on a commission of this sort. But I don't think Bonk has landed yet. I don't think they've defined their purpose yet.
Right.
And I'm not sure it's clear in the charter
Right.
What their purpose is, and that vagueness has made it very difficult
Right.
for them to I think sometimes participate in a way that's consistent with the neighborhood councils
Right.
themselves. They did a great job on the recommendations of the review commission, but I would like to see them identify their goals more clearly and consistently with the neighborhood council system.
Right. I did review.
It's a little wacky, so they're
Right.
taking it fix.
I did review quite a few of the documents in preparation for this and making my decision. And there was actually very little that delineated the bank's particular roles, and so
There go your
right. And between that and the fact that it's a fairly new commission, I do think there's a very unique opportunity to kind of set culture and help it land in a proper place. So I'm excited about that opportunity.
Ms. Hahn, I find Mr. Kim to be exactly what Bonk needs, and I expect that in 1 year within his appointment, it will be twice the organization. Your comments?
Yes, I was, one of the things I have been frustrated with and struggling with is the whole idea of disclosure for our neighborhood council board members. I was one of those, I think one of 4 on the city council that voted against the enactment of this so-called Form 54 or whatever it was, 52, 54. I was one of those that championed getting rid of the Form 700. I have always felt like, we need to make it easier
Right.
for volunteers in this city at the end of the day to just try to make their neighborhoods a little bit better than continuing to restrict them and put on burdens that I didn't think we envisioned when we wrote the city charter. I understand the commission actually made a recommendation back to the city council was for us to take another look at what we just voted on. And I was very curious on what your take is on that whole idea of conflict of interest versus volunteers just trying to make their neighborhood a little bit better.
Right. Right. As with everything, it's a balancing act. And I do think first and foremost, the idea really should be, a city like LA and a state like California, civic participation and participatory democracy is critical. And so the more that we can do to open doors, the more that we can do to help usher folks into sort of places like City Hall is important. But at the same time, we have to balance out with the fact that there is public trust and public funds involved here. And so we need to find ways that we could balance the idea of good stewardship of that trust as well as good access. And so, to me, it's always something in the middle. That
And
we
do you
find
think
best
this
balance.
current Form 52 is somewhere in the middle?
I understand it to be a sort of compromise from where the 700 is, which is
Actually, it's a 700 in
right.
sheep's clothing, I think.
Well, I'm going to have to get into that a little bit more then.
I mean,
before
that's really critical for me and how you feel about that.
Sure. Again, I'm just getting into it. I still need to really, before I make any particular statements personally about this, would like to talk much more with neighborhood council members, other members of the bank before I say anything publicly about that.
Okay.
I know that's a safe answer, but I
That is a safe answer. That's disappointing.
Right. Well, I do believe that
I think this is one of the biggest things facing neighborhood councils right now, whether or not people decide to stay involved in democracy or decide not to. In fact, I've heard specifically from people who said, if that goes into effect, we will not participate in neighborhood councils.
Right. Councilmember, I do believe by principle I'm in complete agreement with you. By the
That's a
specifics.
safe answer, too.
Right. You know what? I'm going to have to run it a little safe, I guess, today, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I would appreciate if you got into that rather quickly. I
Sure.
think it's a
Absolutely.
critical issue for our neighborhood councils.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ms. Hahn moves your approval?
With
Trepidation?
trepidation.
Without trepidation.
Okay.
With full confidence.
Put that into the report.
And I concur. So that matter is approved. Item number
you
2
very much.
is actually on the agenda by air, and I apologize for that. I should have caught it. But this is relative to the fires
Right.
in the American Sayer fires. And it was supposed to be, there was supposed to be a joint hearing of the Education Neighborhood
And public safety.
Neighborhood Committee and the Sylmar
Oh.
Neighborhood Council
Oh.
to work with them on a whole variety of issues, including building and safety planning, water and power, fire, police, emergency management, community redevelopment agency, and public works. So I don't know how this slipped through, but we're going to continue item number 2. There are oh, Chief?
Captain Chamberlain from EOD, and also we have fire department representative.
Yeah, I apologize. This shouldn't have been on our agenda. We wanted to have a community meeting essentially, and to provide every opportunity for the community to understand what we did. And we can't do that from this venue, so, and it was supposed to be a part of a larger package. I actually couldn't remember why we were doing this, but it was part of a motion that included 6 or 7 other departments, so I apologize for that. Thank you. Item number 3.
Item number 3 is the Library Department report in response to motion Weezar Reyes relative to the Library Department's English language instructional materials program and services.
Morning.
Hi.
I'm Chris Marita, the interim city librarian, and this is Toria Aiken, our director of volunteer services. I apologize that this item's been continued so many times. And
Oh,
I've
don't
been
apologize.
ill,
It's
and
it's
I
not
think
easy.
We've misinterpreted or misunderstood what the motion has called for. So we'll start all over. Let's see if we can get this correct.
Let me say that that's not necessary. The fact of the matter is that I have a particular perspective about wanting the library department to do more about literacy. It's not your current. It's not the way that I envision it is not part of your current mission. If we're going to get there, there's going to have to be considerable change in thinking, in culture, and in rules.
Right.
And it's probably the ad code and maybe even the charter, who knows, but.
And changing the profession, the way the librarians have been trained all these years on how we deliver library service. So, I'd like to.
I think they can handle it.
Well, I mean, to address them, that I would like to maybe form a working group that we could
Okay.
look at this whole topic that you're wanting us to embark on.
Okay.
And that would be a working group of educators, staff from LAUSD, certainly the Librarians Guild, who's represented today, definitely the library schools. I mean, this is really big.
It is, and I should say I understand the sort of difficulty in getting your arms around this subject, but the bottom line is that the city of Los Angeles, and particularly this mayor, has been committed to advancing the cause of education.
Absolutely.
One of the most severe problems we have in education at every level is literacy and illiteracy. And it seems to me that we have tremendous resources in our library system, and I believe those resources can be marshaled more effectively to reduce illiteracy in our community. But we're sort of like allowing people to check in and check out. So unless they're already plugged into lifelong educational learners, then they sort of fall by the wayside.
Right.
So what I am speaking of is developing a strategic plan to engage our library system and I like your idea of a working group, because we need to be more than, it can't just be the library department. We have to work with the school district, and we have to work with other entities, and even the private sector, to strategically develop a plan to reduce illiteracy as a proportion in our city. We always reduce things, but the numbers keep growing in terms of population, and so we really haven't had great effect. Or what we tend to do in the literacy, you're not expanding reading in our community. So I like your idea of a working group. Ultimately, Did I submit the motion already to create the Department of Literacy? Okay, so I intend to introduce a motion, I'll just say it publicly, I intend to introduce a motion to change the name of the library to Library and Literacy.
And that's really big also, you know,
Yeah.
that's a charter change. I
Good.
mean, well, yeah, so
Good.
that's really, I
Let's
mean,
take it to the
what you're
voters.
proposing is really, really big. And so this is something we have to, you know, as I've mentioned, you know, develop a working group so that we can study this.
Well, exactly, and I want to work with you on that. And I recognize how hard it is, and how, particularly in this time of limited resources.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we can't start
look
from
at it,
within.
right.
In terms of, I think if you just put it out there to your people, you would get some amazing responses. If you just-
Possibly, right.
You know, particularly if you set goals geographically and allow them to compete, I think we could do some amazing things. And instead of it being an anecdote, a program that really works can be spread throughout voluntarily because the librarians will strive to do it. So tell me how you visualize this working group.
Well, I guess, like I said, we would involve educators, you know, people from LAUSD, other different school systems, you know, the Green Dot schools, you know, the private schools. I definitely envision involving library schools, the schools where, you know, our librarians get their degrees in, because this is different from what we're taught in library school.
I got a great person you could ask to be honorary chair, former First Lady Laura Bush. Write her a
we can
letter.
ask.
That's was her whole thing was.
Right.
She was a
Library.
librarian.
The good Bush.
Yeah, the good one. She was all about reading. It would be interesting to see if she would be interested in her. What's she doing these days? She might be
know.
thrilled
I
to
know it.
chair as an honorary chair of a task force. She might have some interesting. She might have an interesting take on this whole idea.
What I'd like to do is
And of
so-
course, you know, involve the Librarians Guild and staff.
how should we move forward?
Well,
Would you
let me
like to
put out.
present a report or?
Well, let me first put out who is willing to be part of this working group, and, you know.
I'll tell you
I mean,
what,
we need-
why
I
don't you
just
work
have
with,
to- Sure, I'll
my,
work with-
my chief of staff is
Of
Said
course.
Ali, and he comes out of education, so
Right.
can be very helpful in terms of putting together a working group.
Right.
And
And then
then we'll come back with a report in, say, 60 or 90 days. We'll work with you on that and see
At
how we
least
do.
90 days. I mean, this is big. This is really big. I mean, it's, you know, our profession isn't cut out for this, so this is something,
I've
you know.
I've been around long enough that when people say this is really big, it means like we need more time and,
Right.
you know.
Well,
I
only
don't wanna-
because
I don't
we're
wanna let
looking
that-
at-
I'm saying,
we're in the
we'll
middle
come
of
back
the
in a
budget.
report for how we do the,
Right.
how we design the strategic
Oh,
team.
okay.
And
Oh, I see.
set some
A
of the.
preliminary.
A preliminary report. But we'll work with you on it.
Okay.
Directly. But I do appreciate your willingness to do it, and I just think it's time in the city of Los Angeles. Are there any questions?
I just want to acknowledge that I'm here. Councilman Zine, I was at EERC at 8 o'clock. But no questions.
We do have one public comment card, Mr. McQuiston.
Jim McQuiston, I have to weigh in on this. The library does have a formal organization which does teach people how to read. My wife was in it. She taught people to read. It's a weekly thing or a bi-weekly thing or twice a week, whatever the people can spare the time. They come in. She got instruction on how to do this at a meeting out in, I think it was in Sylmar, actually. And in her class, when she took it, was a notable actor who also was devoting his time to teaching people to read. So they do have a program. If you go into the Central Library, they have a whole room which is devoted to teaching reading, and unless you're teaching reading, you're not supposed to go in there. So they do have a program, actually, that has gone on for many years to do exactly that.
Thank you. As I said, they have many programs, but they have no plan. They have no strategic plan, and that, I think...
Well, they do have a plan. I mean, it's
No, they don't.
organized.
No, they don't. Ask them. Ask them, do you have a plan?
We have a strategic plan.
For
but it's-
literacy, reducing literacy?
And actually, one of our strategic plan objectives is to create a literate city. But it's involving with our, especially our adult literacy program. And again, of course, we always encourage reading of children. I mean, we work with children to encourage them, but it's not the program you're
It's
looking
not your, it's not part of your core mission. It should, well, it is, but there's a difference between having a bunch of programs that are not necessarily woven together, and having a strategic plan to reduce the proportion of illiteracy in our city. We're going backward. And that's a whole
You're
different
looking for
level.
a primary focus.
Let me just comment on that. I serve on a military advisory board, and if you take 10 students, 7 of them don't qualify because of lack of education and reading for the military service, which is frightening
Terrible.
when you think of 7 out of 10 don't have the minimum qualifications. So it's
Some
definitely
of
important.
the people that Dorothy was teaching were brain damaged from drug use, and those were very, very difficult for her to try to teach reading. And so they do have all kinds of people in this program, believe me.
Mhm. Oh, I know. I'm familiar with them. Thank you. Item number 4.
Item number 4 is the city attorney report and ordinance relative to amending the Los Angeles Administrative Code to authorize a transfer of unencumbered money in the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment Fund to the Reserve Fund or the unappropriated balance.
Okay. Here we go.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, Terry Sauer of the CAO's office. At your last meeting, you had asked the CAO to report back on the purpose of the proposed ordinance and a couple other items relative to the sweeping policy. To just go over in brief the report that we have that we've submitted to your committee, the ordinance was requested as part of the budget process, and the intent of the proposed ordinance was to provide the mayor and council with greater flexibility in managing the city's resources during these current budget times. Currently, the city does not, the administrative code does not contain any provisions to permit the transfer of funds to the reserve fund or to the unappropriated balance. You also asked how we would define unencumbered funds or what funds would be eligible for transfer, as defined in the ordinance. For purposes of this, as it relates to neighborhood councils, that would be any funds in excess of $150,000 under the terms of the current sweeping policy. It would also apply to unexpended funds currently allocated for the certification of new neighborhood councils that are unexpended.
You're saying unexpended and unencumbered. What's the difference?
Well, unexpended, in terms of unexpended at the end of the fiscal year, those funds haven't been used, and they would be available to either be reprogrammed as part of the annual budget process
You said
or...
as defined by the ordinance? We didn't see any definition of encumbrance in the ordinance.
Correct. I'm explaining based on my discussions with the city attorney what their intent was and to further clarify and to provide you with the information you requested.
Well, but, and I appreciate that, but what is the definition of encumbrance?
Well, there's the controller's definition as it relates to funds in the operating budget in which you have a purchase order, you have a contract, and those monies are encumbered within the city's financial system. For purposes of the neighborhood councils, it's as the funds are allocated through the funding program on an annual basis, we look at anything that exceeds the cap of $150,000, and that's done typically through the budget process.
So we have a different definition for a encumbrance for neighborhood councils?
Yes,
We do
correct.
with the rest of the city?
Correct.
Where does that definition come from?
From the current practice and from the, I think, for purposes of this committee, there's encumbrance. Encumbrance is a term of art that the controller uses to.
I hate that word. I've always hated that word because you can never find anybody who can really define it.
For
But
purposes.
For the purpose of neighborhood council, we have no definition.
It would be anything in excess of 150,000, which is the sweeping policy.
150,000 of what?
Their annual,
Allocated, expended,
After
encumbered?
1 year or 2 years?
after 3 years, because.
Oh, wait, I'm not there yet.
Oh, okay.
I'm asking about the encumbrance. At what point do you define an encumbrance? When a neighborhood council votes on an item to set aside money?
No. Gwen Poindexter, City Attorney's
That's
Office.
an allocation.
I understand that. We defined specifically what is or is not an encumbrance for the purposes of neighborhood councils, consistent with what we thought was the intent of the Budget and Finance Committee and the City Council. So we have in here, for the purpose of this subsection, money appropriated to neighborhood council shall be deemed to be encumbered. And when we wrote the ordinance, we understood an
Appropriated
encumbrance.
by neighborhood.
No, appropriated by the mayor and the city pursuant to the charter.
Oh.
See, the monies get appropriated per charter.
The 50,000 that the mayor gives, that we give them in their budget, is automatically encumbered?
Correct, if that's what the city council wants to do, because we didn't believe that the city council, at the time it gave us the directions, wanted all neighborhood council money to be vulnerable. So we limited to that which would be appropriated and therefore encumbered, except for the categories that the CLA has explained in the report, which is based on the sweeping policy, which is separate city action, having nothing really to do with this ordinance.
So essentially, you're saying the money, it's really from the point of the department. When it leaves the department and goes to the council, it's encumbered to them.
Correct.
Okay,
But it's
okay,
all,
okay.
the monies are all placed in the same fund, because that's
Okay,
the
okay.
charter set it up that way.
I understand, that makes sense. And so now we can talk about, so they don't have to allocate it, they don't have to pass a motion to spend it, but if they have more than 150,000,
Right, per separate city council action. Because at some point, there was a concern the neighborhood councils were not spending the money, and in times
Let
of,
me ask you this, we're saying 150,000, do we have to say after 3 years? Why don't we just say 150,000?
That's actually what the current sweeping policy, that's actually what the current sweeping policy says. It was adopted by council in December of last year. It basically says, at any given time, a neighborhood council may not have more than $150,000. So 150 is the threshold.
And you want to change that?
No, we do not.
That's okay with you?
That's fine. That's what the current sweeping policy is. That was actually based on a recommendation.
That's what we're trying to capture in this ordinance?
We're trying to capture the ability for those funds that don't fall into that category, into the over the 150,000. We're also looking at budgetary funds, savings that the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment may have, or any other funds that don't fall into the category, that aren't allocated to neighborhood councils, so that are in this.
I'm not quite, that's another issue I want to cover, because we've got a.
You've got a number, you're trying to.
They put the money in the same account, and so it's hard to distinguish.
Correct, in the same fund.
That's a different issue.
same fund.
That's-
Yeah,
Same
it's a big
fund.
difference.
That's a different issue. The question I have is, before we get to that, so you're okay with setting the cap at 150,000?
Yes, that we are not recommending a change to the sweeping
Let me ask
policy.
this, because this is, see, I think that if, let's say a neighborhood council wants to build, let's make it something small, a restroom at a local park.
That usually runs around $800,000 to build a restroom at a recreation and parks facility, just in case you're wondering.
Right.
Right. So could they bond? I mean, couldn't they use their, here's my point. They may want to spend more than 150,000 on a thing, but they have to save it. So they're not allowed to do that? Why are we restricting them from accumulating it and spending it on something more substantial?
I think The sweeping policy came about, as the city attorney has described, because neighborhood councils were not spending their money. And so I think the sweeping policy was
understand that.
to encourage.
I'm asking a different question. I'm saying that in trying to solve that problem, we may have killed the opportunity for them to do other things more substantial. So I'm thinking, well, what if they allocate, they say, well, we're going to put $40,000 of our $50,000 a year into this account to build, a restroom at the local park. And it's a 10-year project. Why? So those funds would be sweepable.
It's my understanding, and I would have to defer to the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment on this, is there is a process if a neighborhood council has a larger project by which the neighborhood council can go to the department and say, a situation as you describe, and say, we have this big project, it's going to be more than 3 years, and this is somewhat anecdotal, so I can't.
The attorney's sort of
Yeah,
stuttering over.
yeah, I don't know.
I don't think we've ever envisioned neighborhood councils engaging in
10-year
10-year construction projects. That's really not their role.
Is it prohibited by the charter?
One could argue yes, because they're advisory bodies. Now, the city council has allowed neighborhood councils to use their money for neighborhood improvement projects, but if you really want to look at just the city charter, all it talks about is being an advisory role. So we have to have some reasonable limits as to how they spend their funds in terms of neighborhood improvement projects.
I think, council member, I think if a neighborhood council wanted a restroom at the park, I think probably what would be envisioned in that
What a
situation.
4-year project.
We'd have to look at it on a case-by-case
Yeah,
basis.
I think
and
you have
see.
to
mean,
look at it.
Given the fact that neighborhood councils can't
I don't want to look
contract.
at the case, because then we start imposing our rules on them,
Well,
and
And I would think in the case of a large capital project, they might be partnering with the department to provide, say, fixtures or some aspect of it, but I don't think it was ever envisioned that they'd actually collect money and then go build something on that.
How about a community garden? I mean, I just used one example. I'm just saying there are things out there that they might want to do that go beyond 150,000, and I don't understand why we're prohibiting them from accumulating dollars.
In the case of, say, a community garden,
What if they could get a private donor and they put the money in an outside account? Is that spent?
Oh, Lordy.
My sentiments exactly.
on the private donors and how that money, and then how the
No, it's
city money.
something good for the community. I don't understand why they'd be prohibited.
Bung Wan Kim, Neighborhood Empowerment. Another way that we now have is through the grant program. So if they wanted to use the grant program to fund a program, basically the commission and the department would work with the neighborhood council to develop a contract. So that's another option that we have.
Okay, if a neighborhood council doesn't have, let me be very clear. If a neighborhood council does not have an idea of what they're going to do with their money, after 3 years, and they have 150,000 and they haven't allocated it, I don't have a problem with sweeping anything above that. But if they have a plan to do something good for the community with it, and it costs $400,000, and they have to accumulate it and maybe raise some money on the side too, I don't see why we should prohibit them from doing that, and I believe the way this policy is written, we do.
I mean, I would think one of the things we would be thinking about, and I don't know what the history is, but I think one of the problems with that might be the changeover, the regular changeover in the in the council boards. I mean, one board might vote to do a $400,000 project, they stockpile their money, and then
you sweep it.
And when 5 years, a whole new board comes in and says, hey,
That could be an issue.
that's, we changed our mind. We don't.
But I think the intent of the funding program wasn't built around the intent that you are talking about, councilperson. So I think that this ordinance would preclude what you're talking about in terms of being neighborhood councils having the flexibility to use funds that would be capital improvement type, that would require a longer time period.
No.
And storing money.
This ordinance doesn't do that. This ordinance doesn't do that. This ordinance only allows the city council to transfer
Right.
whatever excess funds are there. and it assumes the existence of the sweeping policy. Now, if you want to change the sweeping policy, then you need to reevaluate it, bring this before the E&N committee,
Yeah,
and then make a recommendation before the city council.
I have no problem with sweeping monies when they don't know what to do with it, and it's just sitting there. I mean, that's one thing, but I don't think we should be telling the neighborhood council, you can't, you can't accumulate your money for a specific project. I mean, if it's specified over a few years, and set aside more than $150,000. There's not much. I mean, you can barely pay for a traffic signal with $150,000.
Oh, that's how much it costs.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I don't think the intent of the ordinance was not to involve the sweeping policy in any way. And for the record, any recommendation to transfer money out of the fund would be vetted through the committee and the budget process. We would not, it would not just happen. We would come to you, there would be a recommendation in a report. It would probably go to the policy committee and to the budget and finance committee, and those recommendations would be done in the context of the city's needs. The sweeping policy was set in place because I think the funding program was envisioned for smaller projects. It wasn't envisioned, at least as I understand it, and I think you have a different perspective on this, but it was originally envisioned for smaller neighborhood projects, not to supplant either the city's capital projects or on that level. But again, in terms of the sweeping policy, because it's not in the ad code, we can go back, we can look at the sweeping policy, we can have additional discussion.
Let me be clear, as one of the council members who voted to establish the neighborhood council, who put it on the ballot, and I think I'm the only one on the city council who can say that, I think I know what the intent was. When I testified before the commission to fund this organization, it was a broad funding recommendation to let them do what they want with the money, not for us to put strings on it and constrict what they can do with it. What? I know you were on that board, but that's true.
Just a point of clarification that we're only talking, I understand, about transferring this money, transferred to the general fund, which was the previous, to allow the transfer to the reserve fund. Is that all we're talking about?
Yes, sir.
So the other issues are separate and distinct from?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so all we're talking about is it would currently go to the general. Now we're talking about transferring to the reserve fund.
Yes. As the ordinance was the result of an instruction as part of the budget process that the council adopted in Exhibit H. Currently, the administrative code does not allow money to be transferred to the reserve fund. It stays in the neighborhood council fund. And this is a mechanism, the council has transferred some money, but there is really no mechanism to allow them to effectuate the transfers. And this was intended to clarify all of that in the administrative code. It was not intended to impact the sweeping policy. And it really was not intended to address the sweeping policy, but that's the unspent neighborhood council funds, the in excess of $150,000, however you. That's a whole separate category, but that was one of the funds that it was intended to address should those funds become available.
So the chairman's concern would be brought up under another motion?
No. What I'm suggesting is this could impact the notion that neighborhood councils could accumulate money for a larger purpose than $150,000.
I don't see that. I just see it transferring like from your checking account to your savings account, not the issue of how much they can accumulate. No. This particular ordinance.
This will
restrict?
Well, what it will do, what will happen, frankly, is that let's say they want to put a traffic signal in, and the cost comes in at $160,000. Okay. They cannot accumulate. They can accumulate $160,000, but then it could be subject to taking by the CAO.
Well, it would be by the mayor and council that we cannot transfer money. The charter does not allow the CAO to just.
The budget committee, and then what will happen is the neighborhood council that wanted to put the traffic signals is going to have to come into budget and testify, no, wait a minute, we want to spend it. Now, could you imagine if many of them did that, or 90 of them had a project that they wanted to save up for, and they all come to budget committee?
That'd be great.
But if they encumber that money, then that should be.
No, they don't encumber it. The city attorney has explained the money is encumbered when it goes from done to the neighborhood council. It's already increased. That's not the issue.
Well, Mr. Chair, I would appreciate clarification on this notion of encumbrance, because our department has been interpreting it this way in terms of if a neighborhood council board wanted to do what you're suggesting, how we've been working with them is a board action basically encumbers those funds. So that even if it exceeds 150,000, we would go to the CAO and say, these funds are not to be swept because a board action committed these funds. So now, if this policy precludes that from happening, then I think we need to be clear about it.
Well, it makes it a lot simpler because it's 50,000.
Right.
It's encumbered already. They don't have to do anything.
When we wrote the ordinance, we took into consideration how neighborhood councils spend their money, but from a accounting perspective and the way the city operates, a mere board action wouldn't be a legal encumbrance. An encumbrance would be something where you've legally committed the monies, and therefore the money is tied up, so to speak, by a contract, by a letter agreement. So that's why, because we understand that neighborhood councils spend their monies differently than departments, we wrote into the ordinance to take into consideration how neighborhood councils spend their money, which is why we said the mere appropriation of funds is equivalent to an encumbrance.
Essentially, they're making the neighborhood councils part of your department. And once you allocate $50,000 to them, that's encumbered. The encumbrance is from your department, not from, in other words, the neighborhood councils don't encumber.
Not in the same way that the city does, right? No, they can still encumber, they just.
They can earmark.
They can earmark,
They can
but
earmark.
under the city's accounting principles, that wouldn't be a technical legal encumbrance that would normally prevent the funds from being transferred.
But it would be something on the record, like you said, if we were going to sweep it, they
For the
could
purpose
come
of
and said,
sweeping,
we've already
all we're concerned
earmarked
about
this
is
money.
150,000.
Correct.
But
So we don't-
currently,
and whether they have spent it or not, we don't care. But when it gets to 150, we're going to start looking at it.
Yes.
Right.
But understand that even without this ordinance, currently, the neighborhood council's monies are swept. They're just swept
to where?
back into.
To where?
Into the Neighborhood Empowerment Trust Fund,
And this will permit to go to the reserve fund.
to the reserve fund, yes. If
That's
the-
what it permits. Okay, now I have another question. There's no guarantee the neighborhood council is going to get $50,000. They may get 20, they may get 10, they may get nothing based upon a budget. So there's no guarantee. And if they want to stockpile money, if they get 5,000 or 10,000, it would take them obviously a longer period of time. Somehow they got this idea of 50,000 a year, it's automatically guaranteed. There is no guarantee. And with the budget we're facing this next fiscal year, they may not get the $50,000, which is another whole consideration that's going to be coming up later.
It's true.
Paul Smith, CLA. I think part of the confusion here, at least on my part, is that the ordinance speaks to encumbrances. The sweeping policy looks at monies that have, as an encumbrance, a contract attached to it, an invoice, so they're legally obligated to pay that bill to somebody at some time, so you don't sweep those funds. Any monies that are in excess of 150 that are uncommitted in some way then get swept, get folded back into the fund, and then you
Well-
appropriate over that, over those funds then get rolled back in, and then you can
Except-
reappropriate them in the
Except that
fund.
the fourth year, they're encumbered another 50,000 by the definition the city attorney has just given us.
Yeah, but
The
there's two-
encumbrance is when they get the 50.
But for the purpose of
For
the
the purpose
ordinance,
of this order, I mean, you can delete that if that's not how you want it to operate.
for the purposes,
That's not my point. I don't, if somebody doesn't want to spend money in 3 years, $50,000, $150,000, they let it accumulate in these bad times, they got nothing to spend it on, that's an inactive council, and I'm not really interested in protecting their money. What I am concerned about are the very active councils who are taking their money and leveraging it against other projects, like going to DOT and saying, hey, we want you, if you kick in street signs, and if Mikla will buy a street sweeping machine, and we kick in $300,000, we will pay it off over X number of years, to leverage their 50,000 to have more impact. I want to encourage them to do that. The problem is that if we have this hard $150,000 limit, then they will not be encouraged. They won't create a culture to leverage their dollars. They're just going to spend it like going to Walmart and spending their $50,000 every year because they don't want it to be swept.
We let
What-
neighborhood councils spend money at Walmart?
Yes, and so,
buck. I want a buck.
here's what I'd like to do. I appreciate what you're trying to do, and besides, we're talking about a very small problem at this point, right? That
Right,
they're
typically.
spending more and more money.
They're spending more and more money. Last year, when the budget was prepared, it was around 237,000 that was swept and then rolled back into the funding program and reallocated. At the moment, it appears we're currently working with Dunn and the Controller's Office for this current budget year, and it may be in the same range. We really have not.
Yeah, well, that's here, but Dennis, let me explain this to us a different way. One of the powers that we have as council members is not a particular allocation. Take your CRA fund. There isn't a significant CRA project that you're going to do that relies 100% on CRA. They get Section 108, they get transportation dollars, all kinds of other dollars
They
that
mix
come
it.
into. You use it as leverage. I think our neighborhood councils can do the same thing with their 50,000. They can turn their 50,000 into $1 million if they do it right. And so, so that's what I'm talking about. I just don't want to stymie that, and I'm not sure I'm hearing that it doesn't sound to me like the department has an understanding of that kind of approach to using their 50,000. So why don't we do this? Let's see. Saeed, tell me, with regard to the ordinance, this sort of turns our little discussion on its ear in terms of the definition the city attorney just said. One of the first things I was going to ask for is a clear definition of what encumbrance is, but we were saying, a board action by the neighborhood council.
I think in this instance, the
You're not on the record.
Saeed Ali, the ordinance as prepared by the city attorney, as Councilman Zine stated, simply lays out the process for allowing a transfer into the general fund. If the committee wants to take that action, they can do that independent of the discussion that is occurring regarding what constitutes the holding. I'm not going to use the word encumbrance, the holding that a hold that a council can place on the money. And the second larger policy question, whether the city wants to encourage neighborhood councils to do a larger project.
Well, I'm going to ask the department to come back with a report on encouraging long-term investment. How would they do, creating a mechanism for the neighborhood councils to engage in long-term, projects that they cost more than their allocated budget. Whether they raise it from the private sector, get it from other city departments, pool together, CDBG money, whatever they can do, but use it as leverage. So I'd like you to come back with a report on that piece. What I'm asking, Saeed, is given the issue of sweeping, are we okay with that? If the department comes back with a report, here's what I'm saying. If you come back with a report, and I'll be happy to work with you on it, to sort of educate neighborhood councils how they can take their $50,000 and leverage it against other funds that are available, or seek other funds in their own communities from the local car dealer or whatever. Maybe not the car dealer at this particular time, but somebody out there, the repossession people out there. That then, if their money is thought to be swept, they will have a clear process in place for why they shouldn't be swept, because they have a particular project in mind. This is what they're going to do with the money. They've raised, 3 times the matching dollars, and then we wouldn't sweep it. I mean, why would we sweep that?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that was the intent. I mean, we have always been of the impression that there would be neighborhood councils that would be working on a larger project, and at some point there would be a mechanism as we put the budget together or as we go through, the annual financial cycle of the city, that on an exception basis those situations could be addressed. I don't think that process has been formalized in any way that everyone says, okay, it's $150,000, except if you can demonstrate, lay out a plan, whatever.
I think, if somebody's accumulated $150,000, then the CAO's perfectly within reason to ask them, what are you doing with the money?
right.
If you're not using, if you don't have any plans with that money, we got to take it. Okay? I think that's,
And the
The
guidance.
department should fold back into its report.
10 o'clock.
Exactly what you're talking about. It says, put the conditions on it. Is
Yeah, yeah.
there a dollar amount?
I'll work
Is
with you
there a
on
time
that.
amount?
We don't, we got to get to council, but I want to clear up
Yeah.
on this issue.
So-
Is the current ordinance okay, given this discussion?
The only suggestion I would my suggestion would be to hold it for two reasons. One, right now, any money that is taken from neighborhood council stays within the done budget. It doesn't revert back out, so neighborhood councils have an opportunity to influence the expenditure of that money for neighborhood council purposes. And given the lack of clarity on the sweeping issue, it may be worthwhile to just hold it until we get some clear direction from Doug.
So Gwen, if you could work with Said
Sure.
and the CAO and everybody who wants to work on it.
Bring it back?
Yeah, we'll bring it back. It shouldn't take more than a week, right?
No, I don't think so.
We should be able to do it.
We
in a
move
week.
forward now.
I think we're real close. This has been an educational process for me. It's kind of confusing, and I understand that there's been some that makes it a little confusing to distinguish which one is which. I think the department's working on some of that. But if you could come back in, say, 60 days with a, and I'll
We'll work with your office, yes.
on this whole notion of using the $50,000 as leverage against other funding opportunities. Thank you very much. Are there any other, I have, sorry, public comments? If you want, here, Mr. McQuiston?
So what are we doing? We're just continuing this?
Yeah, this is public
Okay.
comment. For item number 4.
Yes, item 4. Jim McQuiston, you have to remember that the purpose of the neighborhood council is in the charter. It says it monitors the delivery of city services. It doesn't say the neighborhood council is supposed to engage in any kind of thing except monitoring. That's what the charter says in the plain language. The problem is,
It's not prohibited.
yes, it says it shall monitor the delivery of city services.
but it's not
It doesn't
prohibited.
say that it has any other purpose. I'm not contesting that. What I'm saying is, you have my statement there, that there was amassed over $10 million in this fund, which was not being used, over $10 million. Now, when you look at our budget, and $15 million was the entire budget for all of our social services, all of them, the children, the elderly, and everything else like that. $10 million is an awful lot of money to tie up with no particular purpose. So the idea of moving this money around from one fund to the other fund, you have to remember that pretty soon we're going to have to start cutting down on our police and fire. That's the way it's going to have to happen. We have to do something about this. One way that we can accelerate this idea of trying to figure out a better budget is to get neighborhood councils involved. And as long as you keep giving them the same money and hanging on to it and not letting anything else be done with it, that is really, I would say, an inversion of city services. What we're trying to do is to maximize the use of the city money, not to minimize it. So I would be very, very strong in support of this. And as far as, Mr. Parks calls me the sixth member of the Budget and Finance Committee, I am very concerned about this budget. There's a $400 million shortfall that we're not even talking about. This is rather a drop in the bucket, but we have to get people involved, and that is the way to get people involved. If you delay this, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to delay this and let them spend out the money on something else. I would like to see them notifying their stakeholders on what's going on in their area, and they're not even doing that. So there's lots of things that they could be doing other than public projects.
So you're well over your time. I got to call Dr. Williams. Mr. Kim, do you concur with the $10 million figure?
The total in terms of department and neighborhood council funding.
Doctor, please step forward. But Mr. Kim?
That's the total allocation.
That's the total allocation, okay. It's not unallocated, okay.
My name is Dr. Clyde Williams, 4115 Barrett Road, El Sereno, LA 32NC. As item 1, there's too much on-the-job training by a lot of people. If you're a volunteer, such as many of us on the neighborhood councils, we don't get paid to come down here in the morning. Neighborhood council people do. So one of the things is on-the-job training is a problem for our councils because
You're speaking on item number 4?
Item 4, yeah. I know if you take the money away, what purpose is there to have? On-the-job training by the city employees for neighborhood councils who are volunteers means that there's less money allocated by the neighborhood councils because the neighborhood councils are largely inexperienced. And LA 32 has an average age of less than 30, whereas most of the neighborhood councils will have a lot of retired people because they can afford to do it. If you don't provide direction, how do people know what to do? And especially since it takes maybe 3 months to get a community impact statement done, because it has to go to committee, it has to go to the agenda, it has to be voted on, And the early notice system of the city for the neighborhood councils don't tell us what's coming up. And there's no community impact statement for this one. Why? Because nobody knew it was coming. And next Wednesday, LA 32 Neighborhood Council will know that we may not get the 50,000 even, as Mr. Zinn called. Thank you.
I do want to explain, Doctor, that the problem that the ordinance was trying to solve has shrunk greatly. Initially, it was unclear how much money was left over beyond that $150,000 threshold. And you heard the department say they had a different interpretation of encumbrance. So I really believe that we're talking about a very small amount of money, less than
I hope
less than a couple of 100,000, maybe a few 100,000. I don't know, but I didn't even bother to answer that question because we're gonna deal with it again. But I really believe we're talking about a very small amount of money that is available. And the reason is that the neighborhood councils are maturing and they are realizing that they will lose the money if they don't spend it. And so now they're beginning to spend it with more consistency.
And in many cases, we don't know what's coming down the line, such as this meeting, because the early notification system doesn't work in a sufficient time.
This meeting?
was noticed.
Yeah.
No, this meeting is a regular meeting.
Yeah.
We meet every.
Yeah, but the agenda item as to what's on the agenda. If we don't know, we cannot take a position without 60-day notice almost. So if the councils are encumbered by the 700 form, and now we have to go through a normal resolution where most of the councils are not as well organized as the city council is. Sometimes there's unanimous votes. Thank you. And I know you got to go to City Hall, or City Council.
I understand your message. And I think the neighborhood councils are getting better. And it is a question of time, and it is a question of the city and the neighborhood councils understanding.
It's a great concept.
And we're changing the rules all the time to try to be better, to address all those concerns.
Well, make sure that the city employees who administer the programs know what to do in advance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, this meeting is adjourned.